I always cross the street to begin our walk since my dog, Acorn, likes to walk on grass better than sidewalk. One day, about a month after I moved in, I was walking in front of the greenhouse directly across from the street, and the man who lives there stepped out onto his porch. Typically, I am a fairly antisocial person, and would keep walking or maybe nod and say hello. But when Acorn was a puppy, I taught her to sit or lay down when someone greeted her so that she wouldn't jump up on them, which eventually turned into her laying down and begging to be petted anytime she spots someone. So she saw this man leave his house and drop to the ground, hoping to be petted. This left me standing awkwardly in front of his porch with a limp dog at the end of my leash. The guy seemed a little weird, wearing a bowler hat with long, straggly blonde hair and freakishly tall. But he came down the steps and chatted amicably with me as he stopped to pet Acorn. He asked me some questions, but nothing too weird. If I just moved into the apartment building, how I liked the neighborhood, etc. As I was leaving, a couple who I later learned were John and Lydia walked by with a pair of dogs, and I pretty much forgot about the encounter. About a week later, I was a couple blocks away from my apartment building in a nearby park when I met John as he was walking his dog. He asked if I knew the man in the greenhouse. I told him that I didn't really know him. He just stopped to pet my dog. John frowned. He told me what a nice neighborhood this was, but warned me to be careful around that guy. I thanked him for the warning, but didn't really take it to heart because I figured that they had a neighborhood feud or something. I saw the man in the greenhouse a couple more times after that, but it was mostly just him waving from across the street or saying hello as he was going in or out of his house. Then maybe a month or so later, I met Lydia. Her dog wasn't particularly friendly, so I was going to stay across the street from them, when she picked her dog up and crossed over to me. Her dog was freaking out, barking and squirming in her arms to get down and attack mine, which was why I had wanted to stay across the street. I just wanted to make sure John remembered to warn you about that guy, she said, pointing to the greenhouse. I nodded and told her that he warned me, but didn't elaborate on why. I asked her why, and she just reiterated that it was a good John told me. She said that once the man had screamed at her when her dog peed on his lawn, and that he hated dogs, so it worried her when she saw him petting Acorn. She warned me to be careful walking, especially at night. I understood what she was saying, but at the same time her dog was kind of an asshole, so I wasn't too convinced that he actually hated dogs, and was talking to me for any other reason than to pet Acorn. For a few months I didn't see many people on my walks, as it was so cold out. It was early February when people started venturing out again. I was walking back from the park one day and Leo, a man who lives in the house diagonal from the apartment building, stopped me to pet Acorn. He was chatting my ear off for a good 20 minutes as I was trying to politely extract myself and head inside. But since my dog was literally laying on top of his feet, I was stuck talking to him. After rambling on for a while, he leaned in towards me, suddenly serious. "Have you met the guy in the greenhouse?" he asked. At this point, I was getting weirded out by how many people had warned me about this guy. I nodded. "Stay away from that creep. he said fiercely. No one had really explained what the hell this guy had done to make half the neighborhood feel the need to warn me, so I asked Leo. He leaned in, kind of uncomfortably, close, and whispered, "Let's just say I wouldn't be surprised if they found dead girls in his walls." I was just kind of like, well, fuck. Thanks for the vague and ominous warning, Leo. But could you tell me something that will actually help me know why to avoid him? He didn't elaborate with my prompting, and I resolved to avoid walking in front of the greenhouse if I could help it, especially at night. About a week later, I was out walking Acorn with my friend Claire. We were about 3 houses down from the green one, in front of Mrs. Catania's house. A car was driving past us kind of slowly, but I wasn't really paying attention to it since we weren't blocking the driveway or anything. Then the car slowed down to stop on the far side of the road, directly across from where we were walking. The window to the car rolled down, and the guy from the greenhouse was inside. He leaned his head out of the window and started talking to me, almost completely ignoring Claire except for a creepy-ass smile. This was the first time I'd gotten a weird vibe from the guy, though I couldn't be sure it was just because I'd been warned so many times about him or not. I was polite, but abrupt with my answers, hoping he'd go away, and after a minute he did. He drove less than 10 feet forward, did a U-turn, and pulled up to his own house. I felt a little bubble of panic well up in my gut at that. I couldn't figure out why he'd pass his own house, drive halfway down the block, then do a U-turn, unless it was because he saw me. I asked Claire if she thought it was creepy, and she said it wasn't that weird since it was broad daylight and maybe he just wanted to be parked facing the other direction or something. Her rationalization comforted me, and I decided not to worry too much about it, but to just make more of an effort to avoid him. The more I started avoiding the man in the greenhouse, the more I just happened to run into him. One day I was walking Acorn by myself, and as I was leaving the building, I saw him pull up in front of his house and get out of his car. I turned and went the other way down the block, pretending I didn't see him. After 5 or 10 minutes later, I was a couple blocks away from my apartment building, standing in this grassy lot between 2 houses while Acorn sunbathed. It was nice enough out, so I was just standing there with my back to the road, letting Acorn enjoy the warm weather, while I heard a car run down the street. I still kept my back to the road until I heard a car slowing down and honk. I turned around, and there's the guy from the greenhouse, stopped in the middle of the street with his window rolled down. That freaked me the fuck out because I just saw him getting out of his car at his house. He asked me how the dog was doing. I told him she was fine when she jumped up to stand next to me. I thought she was going to whine to be petted, but she growled. I have never in my life heard her make a noise like that. Her teeth were bared, and her hackles raised up. The guy didn't even seem fazed by it. He just kept leaning out his window, smiling at me as though my dog wasn't practically foaming at the mouth. I made an excuse and swiftly walked away down the street, the opposite direction his car was facing. When I got back to the apartment building, his car was parked out front. Not even a week later, I was outside talking to my neighbor Sadie when the man was driving by. He stopped his car and leaned out the window to say hi to me, completely ignoring Sadie before driving the rest of the way to his house. Sadie looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stay away from that fucking weirdo." I hadn't realized until this encounter that I'd never seen the man speak to anyone else, even when I was walking with Claire, or talking to another neighbor. I started panicking at this point because no one had told me what the hell this guy did. Sadie told me that the guy had been in jail before, but she didn't know for what. She had pretty much the same schedule, working nights 3 days a week, and a few months before I moved in, she was leaving when she thought she saw something move in the back seat of her car. She went inside and got her boyfriend, and when they got back out, her car door was open and there was someone running down the street. She knew it was him because the man running away was really tall and had a black hat on. She called the police, but nothing really came of it. Fast forward a couple days later, and I was outside without Acorn for once, waiting for a ride. Chris, my next-door neighbor from inside the apartment building, pulled into one of the parking spots and stopped to talk to me while I waited. We were standing in front of the door to my apartment building directly across the street from the greenhouse. 2 minutes or so after Chris and I started talking, the door to the greenhouse opened, and I could see my creepy neighbor standing there out of the corner of my eye. The guy stood there for at least 5 minutes. I wanted to look over to see what he was doing, but I didn't want to call attention to myself. Then he yelled across the street to ask how my dog was doing. I didn't have Acorn with me. I was in the middle of a conversation, and he was all the way across the street. I briefly considered ignoring him, but I didn't know what kind of crazy person he was, and I didn't want to set him off or something. So I said she was good, thanks, and turned back to Chris. Then the guy started crossing the street towards us. Chris started to say goodbye and head inside. I grabbed Chris's arm and asked him to wait with me. It was still daylight, but at this point I was already freaked out enough by this man, and I definitely didn't want to be alone with him. Chris must have been able to see the fear in my eyes because he nodded and stayed outside with me. Once my creepy neighbor crossed the street, he stood really close to me even though I backed up towards Chris each time he stepped closer. He tried to strike up a conversation with me with his back towards Chris, completely ignoring him. I just gave one-worded answers and eventually he left, going back into his house. I explained to Chris how I had been warned by multiple people in the neighborhood to stay away from the man in the greenhouse. Chris pointed out to me that the guy came outside, talked to me, then went straight back inside. It wasn't a coincidence he was outside when we were. He must have been watching us. Chris waited with me until my ride came. Then a week ago, Acorn got sick and woke me to go out around 2 or 3 in the morning for a couple days. Thursday night she woke me up at 3, so I slipped on a pair of pants and grabbed my keys, not bothering to take my phone or flashlight to let her out. Since everyone had been warning me about the man in the greenhouse, and I'm not a complete idiot, I walked about midway down my block before crossing the street in front of Mrs. Catania's house. As I crossed the street, Acorn froze for a second, then turned her head sharply to the right and growled lowly. I was wide awake at this point. My pulse beat out an unsteady rhythm against my ribs as I turned the same direction as Acorn, trying to stay calm. For a moment I didn't notice anything unusual until I saw movement and realized there was someone about midway down the next block, crossing the street in the opposite direction as me. I ushered Acorn the rest of the way across the road to the grass in front of Mrs. Catania's house, keeping an eye on the person crossing the street as I did. There was only one streetlight on for both blocks, on the corner by the far end of my apartment building, between both blocks, so it was kind of hard to see the person. I was alert at this point, but tried to calm my frantic heart with the knowledge that this person was already outside before me. The trash can was on the corner of the street beneath the lamp, and I am a total dumbass. So I started walking towards the trash can and, incidentally, towards the person. I was on the side of the street opposite my apartment building, and the person was still midway down the next block, but across the street from me. I reached the corner and was illuminated in the glow from the street lamp. I didn't even realize I looked away from the person, but when I looked back up, I could make out the silhouette much better. From the closer distance, and with the aid of the streetlight, I could tell that it was a tall man wearing a hat. I immediately knew who it was. My blood ran cold. He was closer than before, frozen in place. I tilted my head down so it would look like I was looking at Acorn, but kept my eyes on him. After a moment, he hunched his shoulders and began tiptoeing slowly across the street, towards the side I was on. I was frozen in fear. He must have been crouching because he thought I couldn't see him, and that he had the upper hand. So I didn't want to clue him in on the fact that I could see him. Rather than run as fast as I could to the safety of my building like I wanted to, I walked as calmly as I could manage across the street to my building. I had to take my eye off the man for a second when I reached my building, and when I looked back up, he was gone. I ran as fast as I could to the door and swiped into my building. There was no way he could have gone into a house that fast. Plus, he wasn't anywhere near his own house. He had been creeping between two parked cars when I saw him last, and the only explanation I could think of was that he didn't see me cross to the building and was crouched down between two cars, waiting for me to walk by. I shuddered to think what could have happened had I not noticed him. So, creepy man in the green house, let's not meet. Edit. For those of you asking, I do still live there. I'm stuck here until my lease runs out in the fall. I bought pepper spray that attaches to my keychain a couple days ago. Thanks for all the advice. 2. A little backstory. My mama and papa divorced when I was young. I hardly visited my papa, so he obviously is not a very big part of my life. Now with that part out of the way, I can begin this story. About 13 or so years ago, at the time I was 11, my mama would go out on several dates a night. She was a very lonely woman. When she found men to go out on dates with, she took the chance and went. I don't wish to say that she is dumb, but she wasn't very smart. My abuela often told me to stay away from strangers and not to do what my mama does. After about a year of the whole dating men every night, and I was used to it. Now 12, and very aware of what happens and what to do, I was no longer scared being alone. So this was already the new normal. My mama decided to take a break from her lifestyle and settled for a week. The reason was because she went on a date with this guy and he generally sounded kind of nice in her opinion. After the first date, she could tell different. He acted very shifty, but very jittery at the same time. Unfortunately, he had our house phone's number, and when my mama answered, all she heard through the phone was subtle breathing, and then a low, scruffy voice say, "Angie, ¿por qué no me contesta? ¿Estás bien?" Which roughly translates to, "Angie, why did you not answer me? Are you okay?" Mama answered quickly with, "Sí, Manny. Lo siento mucho. Por favor, no me llame de nuevo." Or, "Yes, Manny, I'm sorry, but please, do not call me again." He then got very angry with her, and I do not feel like telling you some things he said, but it was not pleasant. A few days had passed, and we were calming down. But we had noticed that every night about 6 p.m. there would be a car driving by our block, and then it would speed off after slowly rolling past our house. It was creepy nonetheless. I begged my ma to call the police, but we both knew they wouldn't do anything to stop it, considering previous experiences. There was even a note at her front door that said, "Vigila tu espalda," which means, watch your back. We knew who was doing this, but the weirdest thing was my mom never gave him her address, which meant he had to have followed her tractor. A few weeks later, the incidents died down and we got comfortable again. My mom left the house to go get something from the gas station, and I went upstairs to my room to watch reruns of Seven Vidas. It was quiet because my dogs were outside and my mom was gone, so I enjoyed the silence and watched my show in peace. But all of that was ruined when I believed I heard the door open. I figured it was my mom, and I was too lazy to get my phone and call her. I just figured she'd gone back early. I heard the footsteps upstairs, and footsteps into her room. Once again, I figured it was her. Although it was a little odd, she didn't let the dogs in when she came in. I brushed it off and continued watching. But when my phone rang, and I moaned and slowly walked over to my phone and answered, it was my mom. She asked if I wanted anything from the gas station. I hadn't quite caught on, then said, "You were going back to the store?" We both paused and she answered, "I haven't been in yet." That's when I caught on that someone was in my house. I started tearing up and turning off my TV and getting in my closet and telling my mom that someone was in the house. And that was why I asked her the question. She started freaking out and said she was on her way and not to hang up. "Mommy, please don't come home. Call the police instead. You probably can't handle him," I whispered demandingly into the phone. My mom then said, "Grab your tennis racket from your closet and be very quiet. I have to hang up. I'm calling your father," she said. She hung up, and I could hear the person rummaging through drawers. I held my tennis racket close and backed even further into the closet. Luckily, my dad doesn't live too far away, so he will be quick to get here. My mom called me, and I answered. "Is he coming?" "Yes, I'm going as fast. I'm running lights." I was worried. I heard a car speeding down the road and speed into the driveway. I figured it was my pa. Came out of my closet and looked out the window. To my fear, it was another man in dark clothing. My heart sunk as I rushed back into my closet. My mom was still on the phone and I whispered to her what I saw. She started crying into the phone and telling me she loved me. I could still hear her car speeding through the phone. Minutes passed, and I heard footsteps up the stairs. They sounded like men's, but not my pa's. I cried even harder, and still my ma told me to hush so she could hear. She said, "Do you hear that? Listen." I could hear a car speeding down the road again. "Ma, I don't think that's Dad." She reassured me that it could be him, and she gave me the confidence to look. With that I did, with the tennis racket in hand, and looked. To my relief, it was my dad, and he had something in his hand, black and shiny, and to me it looked like a gun. I hurried back again to my closet and heard footsteps running down the stairs and sounding as if they were heading towards the back door. Then I heard my dogs barking and growling viciously. I have a Rottweiler and a German Shepherd, and they are both trained to attack if I or my ma are not with the person. I figured my dogs were attacking them and came out of my room and looked down the stairs cautiously. Both my dogs were on top of two men and biting and ripping at their hands and arms. My father walked in with his gun, held chest level, and looked at me and moved his eyes behind him, and I knew what he meant. I quietly made my way behind him, and I saw the two men still being attacked, and my father yelled, "Detener," or "Stop." The dogs quickly stopped, and my father walked up to them, and they were bloody. And soon after that, my ma walked in. We kind of hugged each other, and went outside while my father dealt with them. The police came after we called them, and when they came in and found my father was still holding a gun to them, they told my father to put the gun down and leave as they took care of the criminals. It was the man my ma went on a date with. And on further investigation in my ma's room, there were panties all on the floor. They didn't even get locked up for long. Someone happened to bail them out. And that was the last we heard because my ma, my pa and I all moved away then, including our dogs. And we moved to America, and that's where I learned to speak English. But never will I forget the day and all the events leading up to it. All I know is, be so careful and be cautious, because that day could have gone very different if my dogs were not there or if my mom never called. So a terrifying man that has, yes, scarred me for life. Please let's not meet ever again. 3. It was the summer before freshman year, so I was roughly 15. I am now turning 21. I live in the suburbs. I was biking to a park less than a mile away from my house. I went to the park to swing and listen to music. I had done this before just about every other day. It being summer and a hot day, I was wearing a tank top and shorts. As I turned onto the road that led to the park, I noticed a car going very slow behind me. It was a gold square Kia car, the one with the hamster commercials. It was going slow enough that it wasn't going to pass my biking speed. And I am by no means Lance Armstrong. I was biking super slow. I've always been a bit paranoid, so this immediately set off alarms. I immediately stopped my bike. They drove past me and stopped 10 feet ahead. I hesitantly began biking again. This happened 2 more times. I knew something was wrong, but what was I going to do? I should probably mention I did not have a cell phone on me. My dad was putting songs on it. Thankfully, a car came up behind it, so it was forced to move away. I shook it off, thinking they would go away. I biked the rest of the way to the park. The park was surrounded by two small roads, a fence, and the main road I had come from. As I started walking my bike up to a tree to park it, the gold Kia pulled over on the main road. Now this is why I call these kidnappers stupid, other than being so obvious in the beginning. Before my fingertips leave the bike, 2 or 3 of them burst out of the car. Adrenaline immediately shot through my veins. Time felt slow, and a lot was a blur. I could only tell that one of them was bald and muscular. I was on the bike in a second, seeing as they didn't wait for me to walk away from it. I went down the side roads that had wrap around to the main road in a square block pattern. They'd have to get everyone back in the car and do a 3-point turn to follow me easily, which they did. As I came back to the main road, they were behind me. At this point, I refused to look back, so I can't tell you when they stopped following me. But when I turned onto my road, instead of going straight, which was up a hill with no houses, I turned left off of it and up a road with a huge incline. On this road, you could bet without fail that someone was outside. This was why me walking the bike up, it wasn't as dangerous. At the top, I reached my goal. A barred walking bike path. This is where I'd for sure lose them. They couldn't enter this path without crashing through the bars or getting out. The path was shaped like a T. I was at the top right and my goal was the top left. After reaching it and going down a side road, I was back to my road and 4 houses away from mine. I made it back to my house safely. Now, the one thing I've regretted was never telling my dad. I thought he'd be overprotective and not let me go out alone, and, to be honest, at that point in my mind I had won. It was over and all was good. A selfish thought. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened to the kidnappers, and there was no doubt in my mind that they were. For all I know, they got someone else. But now I know I should report these things, so the creeps get caught.